Uprooted from their homeland by 2 decades of bloody conflict, Kenya became the second home for thousands of Somali refugees. It is now time to begin the journey back home for the refugees, but for many it may be a moment of excitement, but also one of anxiety. A tripartite agreement has been signed to commence the process. However, the lingering question is whether the repatriation is being necessitated by circumstances back home in Somalia or the domestic situation in Kenya. Well, joining us to put some perspective on the historical event is Honorable Farah Maalim, former Deputy Speaker of Kenya's National Assembly and also a former Member of Parliament here in Kenya. Welcome to the program. Also joining us here on the program is Mr. Rauf Manzoor, the UNHCR representative here in Kenya. Welcome to Talk Africa. And also joining us on the program is Peter Carrera, a legal officer for the Refugee Consortium of Kenya, joining us on the program as well. But first, let's take a look at the Somali refugee situation in Kenya and events leading to the signing of a tripartite agreement to send them back to Somalia.
Some have been living in Kenya for more than 2 decades, but the signing of this document has effectively sealed their fate. It's time for them to go back home.
It's a beginning of a journey of hope. It's the signal that we've been waiting for. And I think all of us have been wanting to see this signal for a long time.
Kenya has been home to more than 500,000 documented Somali refugees, many of them living in one of the biggest refugee camps in the world, the Dadaab camp. But there are also a huge number of undocumented Somali refugees who have found their way into the country. And the government of Kenya is now troubled.
The large number of undocumented refugees, as well as the sheer magnitude of the entire refugee burden, has created unprecedented security challenges for our country. Unfortunately, these challenges include terrorism, banditry, as well as common criminals taking improper advantage of refugee status.
Even as the Kenyan government seems to say enough is enough, officials say that does not mean that the government cannot help in future if need arises. But for now, though, the exercise is seen as one of the possible ways that could help in the fight against terrorism in the region.
The security of this country is paramount for the stability of the region, and therefore we will undertake everything possible to make sure that we do not have those who are supposed to be in camps residing in the communities.
Some of the refugees are said to have sneaked into the country illegally, others believed to be associated with terrorist organizations such as the Al-Shabaab, while others said to be smuggling light weapons into the country. The Somali government, however, says it is ready to receive its citizens back home.
Terrorism still remains a major threat to our region. The Federal Republic of Somalia is committed in creating conditions that will allow for the safe and dignified voluntary repatriation of the Somali refugees in Kenya and other neighboring countries.
Inadequate assistance should not be used as a way of pushing refugees to return. Instead, ensuring the availability of basic services in Somalia and offering the prospect of a normal life should be the objective of all those who care about the well-being of Somali refugees.
A tripartite commission will now be set up to draft an operational plan and provide policy guidance to give effect to the provisions of the agreement. Kofam Renje, CCTV, Nairobi, Kenya.
All right, after decades in Kenya, Kenya is seeking to return Somalis back to their homeland. First, Mr. Rauf Manzoor, let me start off here with you. Exactly how many refugees, though, are in Kenya at the moment?
The total number of refugees in Kenya is about 600,000 of about 20 nationalities, and that number includes about 500,000 Somali refugees, most of whom living in Dadaab.
What are the circumstances, though, that are leading to their being repatriated, if we can begin there?
In fact, it's not that the circumstances are leading them to be repatriated. It's the circumstances in Somalia mainly, which led us to look at the possibility of developing a legal framework between Somalia, Kenya, and ourselves as UNHCR. It is because we saw that there were some spontaneous returns taking place towards Somalia that we came to the conclusion that we needed to make sure that this return takes place in conditions of safety and dignity, and more importantly, that it is voluntary.
It is voluntary, though. Is that how it is being seen by the Somali refugees themselves? Because we understand, and there are reports that the returnees are not too willing to return as yet. Is it voluntary? Is it being seen as voluntary or forced?
It is very much voluntary. What we believe is that the majority of the refugees for the time being would be reluctant to return because of the circumstances in their places of return. But what we also believe is that if more is done inside Somalia in reconstruction of the country, in rehabilitation of social services, that a number of refugees will be returning because they have been, and you've said that at the beginning, a number of refugees have been outside of their country for the past 20 years or more. You have people whose grandparents were even born in the camp, and that's not an acceptable situation for the international community. They also have a right to return to their places in conditions of safety and dignity, and of course, as I said before, voluntary.
All right, we'll look at that situation of safety and dignity. But for you on Bamalim, though, for Kenya itself, what's been the political, the economic, financial cost of hosting that large number of refugees in the country?
Beatrice, to be fair, you could say that we have carried the burden of the security element in terms of the presence of the refugees are concerned. But in terms of the economic aspect of it, other than the natural resources that I use, the water in the area, because we've got in excess of 22 boreholes. And you can imagine 600,000 people who have got to draw water from the aquifer, which is underground, substantial amount of water. And the rate of the discharge is actually more than the rate of recharge. This from the so-called Merte aquifer, which is in the Ethiopian highlands. To that extent, yes, the degradation of the environment itself is also enormous. It defeats any comprehension. But as far as the economic aspect of it is concerned, I can tell you that we as a country have gained a lot since the presence of the refugees in this country here. The very first time when the refugees came into Kenya in 1991, if you remember very well, we had just been kind of blacklisted by the World Bank and the IMF, and we stopped getting support, whether it's in the form of loans or it's in the form of budgetary support for our own appropriations in aid and all that. We have had in excess of $20 million coming into our country on a monthly basis in the form of remittances, which was coming in from Somalis who are living in the diaspora and who are taking care of their own who are here in the country. When you look at it from that dimension, a lot has been done. They have not become a burden to our own employment pool here. We never find refugees looking to be employed as laborers or looking to be employed as clerks or looking to be employed for any other trade or apprenticeship here in the country. So from the economic aspect, that's why our shilling did not take a free fall in 1991-92. That's why we were always strong against the dollar. And that's exactly the case right now. Probably 3 times that comes into the country now on a monthly basis.
So who has been hosting them, though? If you say they have not been an economic burden to the country?
The cost of taking care of the refugees, other than the security elements, which is a contingent of police officers, whom number, I think, on the optimum, probably 100, 120 in the DAP areas, whose allowances are paid for by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. But in effect, the economic burden of the refugees was borne by the international community. It was never borne by the Kenya government. So that is one area that needs actually to be cleared. In addition to that, it has created employment for Kenyans. I mean, there are thousands upon thousands of Kenyans who either are working right now in the refugee camps or who joined the UN system, and many of them have become very senior people in the rest of the country.
All right.
So in a sense, other than the security aspect and the environmental degradation and the water that is being removed from our own aquifer, there has never been an economic cost to Kenya, our own treasury, from our own consolidated fund. On the contrary, we've had a lot of support from the Somalis.
So what is the reason, though, then, that is being given at the moment for the repatriation process?
Like I told you, the one compelling area, which in my opinion also can be thoroughly mitigated, is the security element. The fact that Al-Shabaab is technically at war with us, because our efforts to try and help our brothers who are right next door to us. That element is there. There's no question about that. The bombings, the explosions, what happened in Westgate. I mean, all these things has, in a sense, a certain bearing on our involvement in Somalia. Not because we are hosting refugees that these people come in here to blow us up. They're blowing us up because we're involved in Somalia, which, in my opinion, I supported that fully. Because if you look at all the countries that have had problems in their neighbors.
All right.
For example, the very first time Liberia had a problem, Cote d'Ivoire was next to it. Sierra Leone was next to it. None of them thought that that problem was going to be transferred to the countries in the neighborhood. Well, how did it end up? Liberia went down the drain. Cote d'Ivoire went down the drain. Sierra Leone, Guinea-Conakry, all of them have had one effect or the other as a result of that. So it's always better for the countries in the region to try and destabilize, help in the stabilization of a neighboring country.
Is it though then justifiable, and is it time for the refugees then to return to Somalia after 20 years?
I'm thoroughly convinced to the idea of stabilizing Somalia and the Somali refugees going back. Let me tell you one thing. Nobody would want to live in the kind of squalor and the kind of degradation that Somali refugees are living in right now in the refugee camps.
All right.
It's a big prison, big, massive prison, probably the biggest prison in the world. Not probably, but certainly no prison of that magnitude is there anywhere in the world because they're not allowed to leave. They cannot move around. There's, I think, about 100,000, or I can't remember, 150,000 who are aliens and who have those aliens passes and who basically are people who are either businessmen earlier on or who are professionals or who are supported by their own families outside and who help us because they consume in the country. And if you have people bringing in that magnitude of money, $40, $50 million a month, then clearly it says a lot also in terms of supporting our economy.
All right.
But the reality of the matter is, at this time, I'm skeptic about it. And when I hear the kind of stuff that comes out of some of the politicians who are saying if the international community is not going to go soft on us as far as the ICC is concerned, we're going to pull our forces out of Somalia and we're going to ask the refugees to go back to Somalia. For God's sake. All
right, Peter, let me get your thoughts on this though. How is the NGO consortium looking at this repatriation process here of the Somali refugees? Is it as a voluntary exercise? Is it a forced exercise? What's your take on that?
As a human rights organization, ours is to ensure, first of all, we are supporting the repatriation, but it has to be done in a way that meets the minimum international standards that have been set. And from the agreement that was signed, I think it has catered for most of those minimum standards that are set for a proper repatriation exercise. But we have to insist that it is a process. Human rights have to be respected in the way that this a whole exercise is carried out. We are watching out to ensure, for instance, issues of induced return do not occur basically, like we've been seeing, whereby lots of refugees are being harassed, facing arbitrary arrests, maybe in what we might see as creating a hostile environment for them to go back. Basically, you remove the voluntariness of the whole exercise and it becomes a forced return instead of a voluntary repatriation. So that is what we are checking about to ensure that the human rights aspect of the whole exercise are respected.
All right. Rauf, I want to get your thoughts on this one, though, because Honorable Malim talked about the conditions back in Somalia. Is Somalia ready, though, to receive, a mass influx of refugees at the moment? How stable is it?
No, and what has been said clearly is that should there be a mass influx back in Somalia, Somalia could absolutely not receive a very large number of people. It is a process. It would be a slow return, which speed would depend on how much the international community is willing to invest inside Somalia to reconstruct that country. I think Farah Malim said it very clearly. You have people who've been outside of their country for more than 20 years. At this stage, do we believe we should help them to return voluntarily and make sure that the conditions in their place of origin are such that they can rebuild their lives? Or do we believe that they should continue to remain in asylum for another 10, 15, 20 years? So that's the question. And as was said, and it's very important to underline that, at no point has Kenya as a government said that refugees would be sent back forcibly. If Kenya wanted to send refugees back forcibly, Kenya would not have signed an agreement with the government of Somalia and UNHCR. So the return and the speed of the return will very much depend on how much we invest in Somalia. Do we need to invest in Somalia right now and make sure that this country goes back to where it was 25 or more years ago? Yes, because as Farah Malim said rightly, living in a camp for 20 years, having a situation, as I said earlier, where you were born in a camp, your parents were born in a camp, your grandparents were born in a camp, is not a situation that people can accept. So more effort on the part of everybody.
A tripartite agreement was signed, as you rightly mentioned, there between the Kenyan government, Somali government, and the UNHCR. What are the key issues there?
The key issues, and as I said, is first the reaffirmation of the voluntary nature of the return, which is a responsibility of the three parties. Secondly, it's a responsibility on the part of Somalia to receive anybody who wants to return. And then thirdly, it's the responsibility of all three parties to make sure that this return takes place, as I said before, in conditions of safety and dignity, meaning that people will be safe when they return, and more importantly, that they will have access to social services and be able to rebuild their lives. So these are all the conditions that have to be met by all parties to make sure that this return takes place. As I said earlier, if someone, a refugee, believes that he still needs to remain in asylum because the conditions for him or her are not met to return, the person has fully the right to do so, and it is recognized by all parties.
Do those agreements, though, sit comfortably with the Somali community?
You see, let me tell you one thing. To be fair and to cut the chase, Somali government does not have a capacity even to contract. Because what safety and security of refugees can be guaranteed by the Somali government? When the head of state in Mogadishu is protected by the international force, he's protected by Ugandans and Burundians, and Kenyans are also in the south. So in a sense, we also have not done our job as well as we should have done. What we did is that we cut a safe swath from our border all the way to Kismayu. We never bothered to clean up the left or the right of the road, of the Liboy-Kismayu road. You see what I mean? Which would have taken very little resources, very, very little resources, indeed, in my opinion. We're not empowering the Somali army in a manner, I'm talking about now the broader international community, most of the donor countries like the Americans and the British and the Germans and the Middle East Gulf states. We're not empowering them to the extent to which they have the capacity to flush out Al-Shabaab from their midst. So where are you taking these people? Are you taking them to a government that in itself is protected by foreign forces? So in a sense, I think if the totality of the whole desire is very welcome, is an assumption or a presumption of a safe Somalia, refugees will want to go back. I can assure you, the day Somalia is safe, not a single refugee would want to sit back and wait here, unless they're going through schools and they have to finish their school and they have a couple of years to go.
All right. Farah Malim, Mr. Rauf Mazu, UNHCR representative, and Peter Carrera to stay with us. We'll return to this discussion in a moment.
Culture expressed. See the world in color.
Make major investments in China.
In child privacy. Why we are living for. That's a fundamental position on China's by leaders. And I think that's frustration. Have a dialogue. Political change and human rights. Don't you think human rights?
Dialogue. Ideas matter. Biz Asia. Asia means business.
Welcome back to the program. Now, the influx of Somali refugees to Kenya was the outcome of many years of violence and political instability in their home country. Now, while the Horn of Africa nation has largely hit the road back to normalcy, it is still very fragile. Would it therefore be reasonable to suggest that Kenya has not seen the last of the Somali refugees' nightmare? Well, still with us here on the program, Peter Carrera, legal advisor, legal officer, Refugee Consortium of Kenya, is still with us here on the program. Honorable Farah Maalim, former Deputy Speaker of Kenya's National Assembly, and Mr. Rauf Manzu, the UNHCR representative here in Kenya. Honorable Farah Maalim, let me start off with you at this segment. You talked about security being one of the main issues reaching, leading the Kenyan government to seek this possible solution here. Yes. How will repatriating the refugees, though, solve that whole question of insecurity for Kenyan borders?
I don't see it. I don't see it. Frankly speaking, I don't see that solving a lot. People will want to come up with a perception that some of these refugees are able, some of the terrorists are able to find their way into the refugee camps, and then how do they find their way into Nairobi? They're not carrying out they did carry out a number of terrorist acts in the refugee camps, but the big issue is that how they find their way to Nairobi, to Kampala, to all these places. It's something to do with our own security machinery. We have a security machinery that essentially has failed us, and it's failed us for a very long time. We have an intelligence gathering system that essentially has failed us. And anywhere, in any country, you will find the need for you to farm up your own intelligence services and your own security machinery, because criminals are everywhere. The terrorists are first and foremost a threat to Somalis themselves. There's 700, 800,000 Somalis, when you add the ones who are here on legal status in the major urban settings, are here not because they ran away from Americans or British or Kenyans or any other community. They ran away from those terrorists who are there in Somalia.
All right. Rauf, though, there are some humanitarian and security issues, though, back in Somalia as well for the refugees. I mean, what would be the situation there? What would be the implications first for Kenya for such a large number to return to Somalia and for Somalia itself?
I think, as has been said before, security and stability in the region is good for everybody. Kenya has an interest in having a peaceful and stable Somalia. Somalia has an interest in having a peaceful neighbor also. The region as a whole has an interest in peace and stability. And the reason why Kenya decided to send its troops to Somalia was precisely for that, to ensure some stability. If we want Somalia to reconstruct and rebuild itself, it requires its population. But as I said before, everything will depend on the security situation in Somalia and on the socio-economic situation in Somalia. This is what will allow people to return. It is if they see that things are improving from a security point of view in their places of origin and from a social point of view that people are going to return.
Farah Maalim, though, did mention earlier on that the Somali government is in itself incapable at the moment of receiving the refugees.
It is, in all processes, in all situations, in all post-conflict situation or in all conflict situation, you see a process and you see time. The situation in Somalia, of the government in Somalia, will gradually improve. The government did require the support of the international community, which is probably not enough. I would say that we would need to have more support from a security point of view to the government of Somalia to make sure it's gradually stabilized, and then eventually that they are in a position of providing security for themselves. Honorable Farah Maalim was referring to Sierra Leone earlier. At some point, the government of Sierra Leone was being protected by foreign forces, and eventually things improved and they got a grip on their own security to the extent that they are now providing help to forces around the world when necessary. So we have to give time to things, and we have to have a true commitment to something. Do we want at this stage to support Somalia and make sure that it gets out of the situation in which it has been for 20 years? Or do we believe that we can leave the country where it is? Refugees will only return to their country if the situation improves.
All right, Ralph, we're going to wind up in a moment, but let me get your final assessment of this whole repatriation process. What, in your view, do you see as some of the challenges that might mar the exercise, and what would need to be done to ensure its successful implementation?
I would say the first challenge is misinformation. It's telling people that they are going to be pushed out, that somebody is going to force them to return, which is not true. I would say that's the first thing. The second thing is, as I said, the situation in Somalia itself and lack of support. If people return, and we have, as I said now earlier, people who return spontaneously, they have to find something back home. If they don't find something back home, they are going to continue to remain in exile in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in Djibouti, and in other places, in other parts of the world.
All right, Honorable Malim, briefly.
I think the two things, or three things for that matter. One is Iraq and Afghanistan are worse than Somalia today. The international community has had a presence in all those areas, even in the midst of the bloodshed that was ongoing. I'm glad now the UN has decided to take its staff there into Somalia. What we need to do is to get the whole international community, including the embassies and the missions, to go into Somalia and open up the missions out there. Let the NGOs also help in going into development areas and schools, hospitals in the immediate neighborhood of Kenya and the immediate neighborhood of Somalia also, where there are areas that are stable basically. These refugees will find a reason to go back, to engage in farming, to engage in trading. The coastline, Kismayu area itself, has the capacity to absorb 60 million people. Jubaland alone can take care of 60 million people. What is 600,000 Somalis out there? We need to take care of their security. The moment we take care of the security genuinely, because I don't trust there's any genuine efforts on the part of the international community to stabilize Somalia. This is just a cat and mouse chase, the way I see it myself. But if there's a genuine efforts on that part, they will go back. They will be a very good neighbor. We will have more to gain from stable Somalia than to gain from what you call a dysfunctional and disintegrated Somalia.
All right. Peter, you'll have the final word on this repatriation exercise there. What do you think needs to be done to ensure it has a successful implementation process?
One thing which I must say is that even the refugees themselves, we've seen them in our offices seeking information about this whole exercise. So I must say that they themselves are interested to go back, but they must be provided with all the information. And they must also be involved in the information gathering process, such that they must go and come and tell their colleagues as to what is happening back in Somalia. Secondly, we don't want a situation whereby we take the repatriation occurs only for a few months and then they start coming back. Institutions must be set up on the other side. Legal status must be restored on the other side so that once they get there, they are able to settle and they are able to make meaningful contribution to their economy. Then to both governments, this agreement must not be beautiful only on paper. It must not only respect the standards only on paper, but it must be so even in practice.
All right, we leave it there for the moment. On Talk Africa, Peter Carrera, Legal Officer, Refugee Consortium of Kenya, joining us on the program. Also, Honorable Farah Maalim, a former Deputy Speaker of Kenya's National Assembly and a former Member of Parliament. And Mr. Ralph Mazou, the UNHCR representative here in Kenya. Gentlemen, thank you for being on the program. Well, I'm Beatrice Marshall from Nairobi. That's Talk Africa for today. Goodbye.